Hello, folks. It's Bradley J. Welcome to the BradCast. That's my new name for this. And I am so excited because my favorite guest of all time, or one of my favorite guests of all time, Richard Pickering, who is the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Historian for Plimoth Plantation, is actually here. And I haven't spoken to you substantively or at all since before the pandemic, right?
Yes, it's been years and life has not been normal.
It's been difficult for
you
me
know,
too, Richard. And
spending Thanksgiving without you, I don't think people understand that it became a rhythm for us to be together every Thanksgiving night after I was here all day at the museum hosting dinners. And when that came to an end, that was very bizarre for me not to have that rhythm of being there.
right, it was something I always looked forward to, folks. This is when I was on WBZ. Richard would come in to the studio late at night, very late at night, midnight, I guess, after working the wheel all day, really, really hard. And you came in, even though you were exhausted, you came in, and I always appreciated it. And it was always fun. You probably stayed for 2 hours, even, right? Usually,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
So most guests stay for
And
1 hour, but the awesome ones stay for two. And Richard
well,
certainly.
think of all the conversations that we had with people. And I remember the woman, Catherine from Maryland, who called and she said, and she was in her 80s, and she told us that she just learned she was a Mayflower descendant. And did I know anything about her grandfather? So I was able to tell her family stories. And then I heard from her, she sent a handwritten note the next week about what that meant. So a lot of things came out of those annual conversations we had with your listeners.
I'm super curious. I need to follow up with that. What did it mean to her? What does it mean to one to find out, as you have, that you are a Mayflower descendant?
Yeah. Well, she had always wanted essentially to know how she was connected to the American past. And suddenly she had this grandfather, and she was only in the classic genealogical sense, she was not Mayflower in the older definition of male to male to male, but she was in the newer definition where the female lines are also followed. So at that point, when she called us, she had learned that she was Robert Cushman's granddaughter. And Robert Cushman was the Pilgrims' business agent, and he printed the first sermon in New England. So he preaches here in December of 1621, takes that sermon back to London, and it's the first printed sermon in New England history, and that was her grandfather. And so she was just so proud to know that her grandfather had written a book, and it was very touching to realize that this woman, who I think she told us she was 88 or 89 years old, was finding a connection to the past at that stage in life.
That is cool. So, speaking of the Mayflower pulls up, and and they don't really have any rules set up yet, and they do this thing called the Mayflower Compact
Right.
to figure out. We should probably talk about how we're going to act when we set up. And it turns out, there are many citadels of historical knowledge around that you can find out stuff about stuff. And it turns out one of those is Dunkin' Donuts. And you, in fact, did some research at Dunkin' Donuts and found out something about the Mayflower Compact, correct?
So every morning and on the weekends, I am down the street at the Dunkin' Donuts in Wellfleet working on my book. And right now I'm working on a biography of Nathaniel Morton, who was William Bradford nephew. And Nathaniel Morton wrote the first published history of Plymouth in 1669. But we're also working on a project to try to understand the influence of the compact on American history, and did it truly influence the Constitution, which I think it did through John Adams. But I was doing some research on Sunday, and in sorting, just Googling on Nathaniel Morton and trying to find every reference that I could, I was also putting in the title of his book, and it took me to a letter collection between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson at their end of life friendship. And it's referencing this book that John Quincy Adams has just sent his father, that he jokingly bought in Berlin when he was a diplomat. And he's flipping through Thomas Morton's New English Canaan about Merrymount. And John Quincy Adams had never heard anything about Merrymount and the Maypole, but he looks down and it has the word Braintree in it. So he goes like, it's Braintree. I'm going to buy this book for my dad. So he sends New English Canaan back to his father in Braintree. And John Quincy Adams is writing to Thomas Jefferson about this book his son sent him. So the two men start researching everything they can find out about Thomas Morton and the Bacchanalia at Merrymount. And Thomas Jefferson says, you haven't referenced this book, New England's Memorial, in all of our letters. So Thomas Jefferson goes to the pages in Nathaniel Morton's book, writes them out in longhand for John Adams, and sends it back. I had just learned, because I had been reading David McCullough's John Adams again, I had forgotten that in his debt at the end of life, after Washington was burned by the British, Jefferson, to get out of debt, sold his library to the federal government to replace the Library of Congress. And yesterday morning, we discovered his New England's Memorial is still at the Library of Congress. So now I've got to get to DC to look at what marginalia is in there in Jefferson's hand. But that also means Jefferson owning New England's Memorial means that in the library at Monticello, he had the second printed version of the Mayflower Compact.
Wow.
So, not only do you have Adams worshiping the compact, but we now have the possibility of, are some of the opening passages of the Declaration of Independence being shaped by Jefferson's knowledge of the compact.
Wow.
So
that's pretty heavy.
Yeah, to think that book from 1699 ends up in Virginia and that Jefferson has read it is pretty amazing to me.
Well, that is something. And you just never know, I guess. You learn something every day. You learned a lot that day.
Yeah.
Wow.
The job is really amazing. And I've been with the museum since 1984, off and on. I've left for graduate school sometime. But to realize that what I was saying as a young man is no longer what we believe today, that our perception based on all those decades of research and changing perspectives, that the museum is very different than when I started, as it always should be, that we should never be fixed like we're a wax museum.
Right. So it is almost Thanksgiving, and you are the man. There's probably no more expert on Thanksgiving than you. So let's talk about it. Here's how I'd like to get to it. Can you give me the high points, or I should just say the key points, because a lot of the points weren't that high, the most important points of the first year in terms of the experience for the Pilgrims and the interaction with the natives? Just like a 3 or 4, 5 key moments. And then we'll get into the actual Thanksgiving part.
Well, for me, and you and I have talked about this in the past, but for those who are new to us, my mentor when I was a young man was a Wampanoag historian by the name of Nana Pashamet. And when I left the Pilgrim Village as a role player and became a research associate, part of the work was answering press questions every autumn. And when I was new, Nani would sit next to me while I was on the phone, and he would say, Richard, this is what's going to happen. A reporter is going to ask you about the first Thanksgiving, and immediately he or she is going to want to jump to King Philip's War. And he said, I can't let you allow that to happen. He said, because in that, looking away from what happens in the first year, the mastery of realpolitik, of Massasoit Usamiquin, is utterly lost. He said, in moving from this moment and that year to the war, what gets lost is that sachem is shaping the entire experience of the region. He is shaping how Native peoples from other communities interact with these newcomers, and he is shaping the perception of the English of everything going on around them. And he is choosing, like the most regal of leaders, he is choosing the moment when he is seen. So the English only see him surrounded by trains of men with great dignity and with great power. And he said, put the focus there. Let people understand what a masterful leader this man was. And it's not that he was friendly toward these people. It isn't a kumbaya. It's that a very sophisticated leader who his people for 3 generations have been under the thumb of the Narragansett to their west. These new people with their new technology could enable him to get out from that position of being a tributary leader and regain the sovereignty his grandfathers had. So this is a man of incredible sophistication who is manipulating many communities around him, both indigenous and the new English people.
So talk about the first interaction. That's about the most interesting thing. The scout sent out, and then it gets set up for a little later, and the preparation for that visit. And by the way, the museum is, for a period of time, set up to for that moment, correct?
Yes. So what we've done, this is the second year in a row we've done it. The guest response last year was huge. We turned the entire month of November into the day before Massasoit Usamiquin and his men arrive at Plymouth. So we don't know exactly why Native people are at Plymouth for the event we now call the first Thanksgiving. We do not know whether invitations have been sent. We do not know if he was already on the move, because this is a time of year when sachems, with the harvest in and no longer having those agricultural responsibilities, could reconnect with other communities by making autumnal visitations. That could have been going on as well. But for the sake of the presentation at the museum, we've chosen that they know he's coming. And so our guests, every day when they're here, they are walking into a situation where the town is getting ready to entertain all of these people. For me, the research over the last 12 to 15 years has been the most exciting, because we've been working with UMass Boston's Fisk Center for Archaeology with David Landon and Krista Baranek. And what they have uncovered in downtown Plymouth is the certainty of what happens that first night in March of 1621. So the English are in Wampanoag country for 5 months before they ever exchange a word with a native person. So when Massasoit Usamiquin comes from Pokanoket in late March of 1621, that's the first time they are going to speak. Edward Winslow is sent across Town Brook as an ambassador to invite Usamiquin into the tiny little village of only one complete house and a bunch of unfinished houses. And he remains as a hostage to ensure the sachem's safety when he's among the English. And over the course of hours, they negotiate a 5-point alliance. That night, Massasoit Usamequin returns to have another conversation with Governor Carver, and he says, our wives and our women are nearby in the woods, and we'll be back in 8 or 9 days to plant on the other side of the brook. So everybody distrusted that as just English marketing, that there were good relations. And what the archaeology is showing is that these people were living face to face every day early on. So now that changes who is at the first Thanksgiving, because that means there are Pokanoket women and children on the other side of the river. So it's not just Native men that are there. There are also all of those families that were planting near the English. And that additionally changes the way we understand the story of Tisquantum teaching the English how to plant corn, beans, and squash. It's not that he's doing it. Those plants within the period were gendered. Women did not touch tobacco. Men did not touch corn. Those plants had gender identification. So if it's the case that the families are on the other side of the brook, what Tisquantum is really doing is he is translating what they are watching women do.
Wow. And speaking of how to plant, go ahead.
And so the fact that you have that daily presence of Pokanoket and other Wampanoag peoples on the other side of the brook, that means that it's really Wampanoag, it's indigenous women who are ensuring the success of Plymouth by a willingness to teach when it is ripe, when you bring it in, and then how you process it. No one on Mayflower, except for Stephen Hopkins, had ever seen maize before.
Wow.
Wouldn't have known what to do with it.
Wow.
So it is that exchange of technologies that enables the English to survive. So much focus has been put on that they saved them the first winter, and that isn't the case at all. There's no relationship between Native people and the English the first winter at all. They're living from the stores that they brought from England with them. It is the second winter, and that willingness to share indigenous agricultural practices that ensures the colony the second winter.
We are with Richard Pickering, Deputy Executive Director and Senior Historian at Plymouth Patuxet Plantation. You spoke about the natives teaching the Pilgrims how to plant corn, and back when I was a kid, we used to drop a little hornpout, a little fish in there, and was that it? And if so, it would have been important to be able to catch fish. And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the Pilgrims brought fish hooks, but they brought the wrong size, and they couldn't catch any fish until the natives showed them how. Is that correct?
For the taking of herring in the springtime for planting as manure, those, because of I don't think we can even imagine how many fish were in the streams coming up to spawn. Those could be taken in a basket, all the herring that were needed for planting. The hooks that they brought were intended for deep sea fishing for commercial reasons, because they had intended to be fishermen sending cod and dried fish back to the markets in Spain and to the English markets. And these were not fishermen at all. They were farmers and they were craftspeople, and they just bought the wrong supplies.
So what you've been talking about has spurred Lola Pope to make a comment, to give a comment. The power of indigenous women, especially female sachems, as you can also read it, is underreported and understated. And she references a book by Lisa Brooks called Our Beloved Kin.
Exactly. And Lisa's work is incredible, and she's spoken here at the museum a number of times, and we are strongly reliant on her work, both Our Beloved Kin and The Common Pot.
All right. Let's talk about Thanksgiving and the how familiar that Thanksgiving would be to us, and vice versa. There are some similarities. There are some things that have carried through. For example, the four pillars of Thanksgiving, food-wise, they may not be exactly in the same form. They may not have had pies, but still, pumpkin was on the table.
Yep. And so the only reason that we know about the event that has popularly become the first Thanksgiving is the survival of a letter by Edward Winslow that he writes in mid-December 1621 that is never intended for publication. He's writing to a friend. He has no idea that his privacy will be disregarded by the Pilgrims business agent who needs to put out an advertising pamphlet about the colony. Robert Cushman arrives almost a year to the day after Mayflower aboard a ship called the Fortune. He's here for a month. They fill the Fortune with clapboard, with sassafras, with furs to send back a first payment to the merchants. Cushman is in the English Channel when the ship is captured by French pirates who take them to a little island no bigger than Martha's Vineyard. But it's a perfect piracy island because the island is shaped like a capital G. So they can bring the ships inside this harbor where any other ships passing the island can't see all the contraband ships. The Marquis of this piracy island demands that all of the correspondence that Cushman has be brought to him and read to him. Cushman also has a manuscript that is sent by Bradford to describe the first year. The Marquis finds it so delightful he won't give it back. So when Cushman gets to London and he has to advertise the colony, he starts using some of these letters that people have written to fill in the blank space to cover the time. Governor Bradford, in his manuscript of Plimoth Plantation, he doesn't write about this event in the fall of 1621. If that letter hadn't been captured by the pirates and made it into print, we might have never known about the first Thanksgiving. We know from Edward Winslow's description that, as he would term it, King Massasoit is there with his 90 men. They are together for 3 days of feasting and sports and military demonstrations. At one point, Massasoit sends his men out hunting, and they return with 5 bucks of venison that are given to the chief men within the English town. And Nani used to tell me about nonverbal messaging. And Nana Pashmit said, Richard, I don't think the English had any idea that when they start coming ashore at the Cape and there are elderly people, that there are women and there are children, that native people looking at them from the shore are, for the first time, they're seeing English women, children, and elderly. For decades, they have seen men coming for fishing and trading, but not families. So that means they're different. And then those are people you never bring into situations of danger where there is the potential of any kind of skirmish. So that's a non-verbal signal of peaceful intent. For the English, looking at that gift of venison, that's the meat of gentlemen, that only men who have deer parks where they can raise deer and hunt them on their own, only the gentle folk have venison. So for them to be gifted in this way, it's a mark of gentility on the part of indigenous people in the eyes of the English.
So it sounds that it was a completely positive experience and an example of friendship and diplomacy, and not what some recent detractors have been saying about Thanksgiving. Can you talk about that and how that narrative has kind of changed over the last few years?
I think in many ways we're projecting ourselves backwards on the people of the past. And instead of stepping back and casting a cold eye, in our current situation nationally, where we're so uncivil and so disrespectful and without trust one for another, we project that backwards. And what Nana Pashmet taught me as a young man, he said, Richard, let every moment stand on its own. And he said, in that autumn of 1621, those people were reaching towards one another in a sophisticated way of mutual support. He said, remember, there are only 52 English men, women, and children, and half of those 52 are under the age of 16. At a minimum, in those 3 days, you have 2 males for every English person. And then in Edward Winslow's letter, he says, King Massasoit and his 90 men, comma, amongst others, comma. And we know that on September 13th, 1621, so maybe a month before what we estimate to be the first Thanksgiving in late September, early October, that there are 7 sachems here in Plymouth with Massasoit Usamequin, and they enter into the same alliance with the English that he has done in the spring. So that is not only cementing alliances, but it is proving how influential this man is, that he can bring these other sachems to the English. Now, these men are probably traveling with numbers of men to impress the English, as Massasoit did when he was traveling. So now think of these 52 English men, women, and children who may be surrounded by hundreds of native men at one point with all those sachems there. So the great tragedy of King Philip War and the movement of Wampanoag people in English eyes from having sovereignty to subjection, the way to understand that is looking at every moment on its own and its transition from one perception of the other to another perception. So, early on, you have the English writing of the native people around them. And Robert Cushman says, they are as kind to us as Christians, though they know not Christ. But 50 years later, when their land is needed, when the grandchildren are perceiving Wampanoag people as being in the way, that is when you see this rise of a really derogatory representation of how those people are living, because suddenly they're in the way of commodities that vast population needs. Very different when it's 52 people and no land pressure. And then by King Philip's War, there may be anywhere from 35 to 50,000 English people in southern New England.
Kind of an observation and a question based on what you've just said. When first, Massasoit Usamequin shows up with 6 other sachems, I guess, 7 other sachems, and
6 or 7,
each with an entourage. I wonder, and this is not, I'm just wondering this out loud. You don't need to answer. If, in addition to showing friendship, he was showing strength, like, we're pretty powerful. It really, don't mess with us. We know that we have benefited by our relationship with you, but we're pretty powerful on our own, so don't get any ideas. But my question is, they entered into this alliance. They helped him out because down the road they might need their help against the Narragansett or someone else. Was that favor ever called in? Did they say, we need you to fight for us now? Did that happen?
No, actually, it didn't. It became a relationship that was one of economic interest, the exchange of goods, furs for European trade. But no, English people never needed to stand next to Massasoit Usamequin in that way over the course of time. Your first observation, Nana Pashmet would have agreed with you 100%, that he said in the decades when French, Dutch, English fishermen and traders were coming every year. He said these were like gnats on the land. And you kind of wanted to do this with them, but they would go away with the change of the season, that as soon as they got the fish or the furs, by August, they're gone and they won't be seen again until February or March. But he said when there's this constant presence on the land, indeed, Massasoit Usamiquit is showing the English how powerful he is, not only to reassure them, but also to put them in their place.
Back to Thanksgiving, the celebration and the meal part of it. The food, some of the food's the same. How much of the food is the same? How much would we recognize?
Well, as you said, the pillars of the meal are there. They're just not being presented in the same way. And I did a satellite feed to 28 or 30 different television stations last Wednesday. Boom, boom, boom. And in the way it works, a whole series of questions go out to the anchors so they can structure these 5-minute interviews with me over the course of the hours I'm standing in front of a camera. And invariably, the question I got again and again and again was, what myth are you constantly busting? And I had to say, I really hate the term myth busting, because typically the person who thinks they are busting a myth is just making a new myth that will have to be busted. And the one that cracks me up in maybe the last 15 years is people saying, definitely, there was no turkey at the first Thanksgiving, which cracks me up at the thought that Edward Winslow tells us Bradford sends 4 men out fowling, and in 4 hours, they take enough fowl to feed the entire company for a week. And I get this, like New Yorker cartoon image in my head of Pilgrims with muskets and blunderbusses purposely avoiding the turkeys. Like, no.
That would be weird that anyone
would.
would.
Can't bird.
So what would make people think that there was no turkey there? I mean, there were turkeys here now. There were turkeys here then. There were a whole lot more turkeys then. What would make them say that?
Unfortunately, instead of doing close readings and really revisiting a text, people like to say new things. And because the word turkey isn't there specifically, couldn't possibly have been among all those fowl that are described being taken in those 4 hours. Right. And so I said to the reporters, it's not that we know whether it's there or not. It's just, if present, it's not the centerpiece that it will become in the 1700s and the 1800s. But it doesn't mean it's not there. Like, why would it only be fine to say swan, geese, turkey, swan, geese, goose, teal, but no, definitely not turkey. So it's that things like pumpkin are there early on as what is known as the ancient standing dish of New England. It's the first printed recipe in any New England publication, and it's cubed pumpkin, slowly boiled, mashed down, more pumpkin being added, slowly boiled, mashed down, and then it gets seasoned. So there's no crust. The wheat didn't do well here the first winter, the first harvest. So there was no, what they would have called a coffin for containing a pie. But pumpkin was there. Cranberries might have been there, not being used as we would in a sauce or a sweet sauced way, because sugar was so rare, but it might have been used as a kind of pressed false vinegar for the sourness of the juice in cooking.
Wow.
So the elements are there, just not in the same way we know them now.
I think it's important to point out how difficult life was and how physically strong these people had to be, and mentally strong. We forget that when they show up, not too long after, it's freezing cold and they really don't have much shelter, and you got to spend so much time cutting down trees and starting fires and just the very basics. Really hard work just to not die. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, there must not have been any time from just hanging out at all. I don't think that we really can understand the brutality and the difficulty and how hard it was and how physically strong these people must have been.
Yeah.
You're cutting wood or you're gonna die.
Hmm.
You're going out
And
hunting,
the
and the natives too. A physical life.
And for those people at the first Thanksgiving, all of them have experienced unimaginable death. That the native population between Portland, Maine, and the current Massachusetts Rhode Island border is devastated by a series of epidemics from 1616 to 1618. In some places, they're losing anywhere from 70 to 90% of that population in a very short amount of time. It dwarfs the horrors of the Black Death in Europe in 1348, dwarfs it. And then for Plymouth to lose half of its population in 2.5 months. So these people are all reeling from not only medical crisis, but in some ways, a spiritual crisis as well. So, the powers within indigenous culture, those medicine people not knowing what to do with these strange illnesses that they're seeing, for the English to look at that high number of death, and they're living in a providential world where every action within their life is an act of God. So what does that mean?
Yeah, right.
The kind of standing on jello must have been extraordinary for all of them at that point.
And it gives you an idea of how much they must have detested life back in England or Amsterdam or wherever they came from.
Mhm.
It must have been god awful for them to come over here on that little tiny ship and go through this hell. They must have been, well, half of them highly motivated by religion and half of them motivated by profit. And just, I guess was it crowded and nasty over there? Were there any other driving forces that drove them over here?
The poverty in Holland, being immigrant laborers in a foreign city and not being able to have access to the best positions, the best financial positions, and people seeing their children age and their health failing, because even little ones, historian Jeremy Bangs, the great scholar of the Pilgrims experience in Holland, he talked about little kids 2 years old working with their mothers who were spinning. And these kids are helping their mothers, standing there taking the wool that's coming off of the spinning wheels. And that Bradford talks about children aging before their time, and then English people finding their children becoming very Dutch and in their eyes very worldly. They needed to get out. And then what has often been overlooked is that the Dutch in this period are committed to liberty of conscience, but that doesn't mean there still aren't prejudiced people there. And there are distinctions between the Calvinists and the Arminians, who hold different positions on the nature of free will within the Christian experience. And it is now getting to the point in 1617, 1618, there is violence in the streets of Holland. And one of the men who comes over on Mayflower, he is on a street in Leiden when he is almost stoned to death by teenagers who take him for an Arminian, even though he's a Reformed Christian Calvinist, and he almost dies of his wounds. So he is one of the first to die while Mayflower is still in Provincetown Harbor, and possibly it's because his health had already been weakened the year before by the physical attacks in the city. So we need to remember it's poverty, and there is violence that is being generated by religious bigotry.
Before we go, is there anything going on at the museum? Any programs? Any things that you would like people to know about? It's a wonderful destination. You can have a wedding there. You can have a business meeting. They have dining all the time, right?
All the time. I will spend Thanksgiving and what I call faux Thanksgiving on Friday, because for everybody we can't accommodate on the holiday, we do it again on Friday. So I'll be hosting 5 seatings of the Story of Thanksgiving dinner, which the dinner itself is based on the dinner served at Harvard the year Lincoln declared the first national Thanksgiving in decades. So that's going on. And what I love is our guests are coming from across the country, around the world, and for them, it's kind of their destination Thanksgiving. And I will say to our guests when I'm hosting that meal, you are seated with strangers. Not everybody at your table is your family. Not everybody at your table is a friend that you've brought. I need you to reach out to that stranger and ask their story. And what amazes me is that people do it. And so at the end of a meal, they're coming up and saying, well, this family that I had dinner with, they were 3 siblings, and they are the first generation out of the Pennsylvania coal mines. Or we're cousins. We found out we're related. How do you take that meal and use it what it's for coming together in civility and curiosity about someone else? On Friday, of this week, Jan Brett, the great children's book illustrator and storyteller, Jan Brett is starting her national book tour here at the museum. So people can come, and her artwork is going to be on display at the museum. She will be here doing a book signing. And then the first weekend in December is really a time for everybody to come to the town of Plymouth, because there are 2 major craft fairs going on. So the one here at Plymouth Patuxent Museums, we are hosting Indigenous artists from across the country, as well as artisans from around New England. And for 2 days, there'll be 70 artists here showing their crafts. And there'll be a hayride, because our craft fair has grown so big, it's now all over the campus of the museum. We had to keep taking in more buildings as more artists wanted to be here. So there'll be hay rides for people to get them around the museum.
So are all the Thanksgiving seating sold out?
All of the Thanksgiving seatings are sold out, but I do think we have a walk-in buffet. But people should go to our website, plimoth.org, to check that out. They can get the latest information at the website.
Okay, I don't want to leave with forgetting something. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the museum or anything else before we go?
No, it is so good to see you. I cannot even express how this normalizes Thanksgiving for me again.
Well, same here. Thank you very, very much. And thanks to this angle of technology for making it possible. And thanks to all your staff for the great job they do and for making this possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully let's chat sometime before next Thanksgiving.
That would be great.
Okay.
Come down and spend a day.
All right. Richard Pickering, Deputy Executive Director and Senior Historian of Plymouth Patuxent Plantation. Thank you very much, and a happy Thanksgiving to you and all yours.
Happy Thanksgiving to everybody out there, too.
Bye-bye. Okay.